The Greek historian Herodotus is responsible for some of the earliest accounts of secret writing. He chronicled how Histioeus shaved the head of a messenger and then wrote upon his scalp. After waiting for the hair to regrow, he dispatched the messenger who could travel unhindered because any guards en route would not be aware that he was carrying a message. Upon arrival, the messenger simply shaved his head and showed the message to the intended recipient. This strategy for achieving secret communication relied on simply hiding the message and is known as steganography, from the Greek words steganos, meaning covered, and graphein, meaning to write. In the 2,000 years since Herodotus, various forms of steganography have been used all over the world. The ancient Chinese wrote messages on fine silk, which was then scrunched into a tiny ball, covered in wax, and swallowed by the messenger. In the 16th century, the Italian scientist Giovanni Porta described how to conceal a message within a hard-boiled egg by making an ink from 1 ounce of alum to a pint of vinegar and then using it to write on the shell. The solution penetrates the porous shell and leaves a message on the surface of the hardened egg albumen, which can only be read when the shell is removed. Steganography also includes writing in invisible ink. Back in the 1st century AD, Pliny the Elder explained how the milk of the Tithimalus plant could be used as an invisible ink. Although transparent after drying, gentle heating chars the ink and turns it brown. Many organic fluids behave in a similar way because they are rich in carbon and therefore char easily. Indeed, it is not unknown for 20th century spies who have run out of standard issue invisible ink to improvise using their own urine. The longevity of steganography shows that it certainly offers a modicum of security, but it suffers from a fundamental weakness. A thorough guard might routinely search any person crossing the border, heating blank sheets of paper, shelling boiled eggs, shaving heads, and so on, and inevitably there will be occasions when the message is uncovered, at which point the enemy can read the message. So, alongside steganography, there was the evolution of cryptography, derived from the Greek word kryptos, meaning hidden. The aim of cryptography is not to hide the existence of a message, but rather to hide its meaning. One of the earliest forms of cryptography was the substitution cipher, which was independently invented by various ancient civilizations. The substitution cipher appears in the Kama Sutra, which advises women to use it to conceal the details of their liaisons, and the first documented use of a substitution cipher for military purposes appears in Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. The substitution cipher turns the original message into an enciphered message by substituting each letter with a different one. So every A in the original message may be replaced with P, every B with K, and so on. In effect, the original alphabet is being rearranged into what is known as the cipher alphabet. There are over 400 million ways of rearranging the letters of the alphabet, and so an enemy codebreaker cannot hope to decipher an intercepted message by checking every possible rearrangement. In fact, if an enemy agent could check one of the possible rearrangements every second, it would take roughly 1 billion times the age of the universe to check all of them. For over a millennium, ancient scholars considered that the substitution cipher was unbreakable. However, codebreakers did eventually find a shortcut to deciphering messages. The breakthrough occurred in the East and required a brilliant combination of linguistics, statistics, and religious devotion. The 8th century AD heralded the golden age of the Islamic civilization. Having acquired the art of paper-making from the Chinese, the Arabs were able to establish a burgeoning publishing industry, which satisfied and encouraged the most literate and learned society in the world. In just one suburb of Baghdad, there were over 100 bookshops. Religious scholarship was also at its peak, and this provided a vital ingredient for the breakthrough that would destroy the security of the substitution cipher. The Quran consists of 114 revelations made to the Prophet Muhammad between 610 and 630 AD. Arab theologians were interested in establishing the chronology of the revelations, and they did this by counting the frequencies of words contained in each revelation. The theory was that certain words had evolved relatively recently, and so if a revelation contained a high number of these rare words, then this would indicate that it belonged to the latter part of the chronology. Theologians also studied the hadith, which consists of the prophet's daily utterances. They tried to prove that each statement was indeed attributable to Muhammad. This was done by studying the etymology of words and the structure of sentences, in order to test whether particular texts were consistent with the linguistic style of the prophet. Significantly, the religious scholars did not stop their scrutiny at the level of words. They also analysed individual letters, and in particular, they discovered that some letters are more common than others. The letters A and L are the most common in Arabic, partly because of the definite article al, whereas the letter J appears 10 times less frequently. This apparently innocuous observation would lead to the first great breakthrough in code breaking, made by the Arabic polymath Al-Kindi, otherwise known as the philosopher of the Arabs. Al-Kindi was the author of 290 books about medicine, astronomy, mathematics, linguistics, and music. His greatest treatise, which was only rediscovered in 1987 in the Süleymaniye Ottoman Archive in Istanbul, is entitled A Manuscript on Deciphering Cryptographic Messages. Al-Kindi's code-breaking technique is most easily explained by imagining a message, originally written in English, which has then been encrypted and which has fallen into the hands of an enemy codebreaker. Al-Kindi advised the codebreaker to look for the most common letter in the encrypted text. If the most common letter is, say, W, then this probably represents the letter E, because E is the most common letter in English, accounting for roughly 13% of all letters. Similarly, the second most common letter in the encrypted text probably represents T, and the third probably represents A, the second and third most common letters in English. This technique, known as frequency analysis, relies on linguistics and mathematics, as well as a certain level of guile, guesswork, and intuition. Consider the following brief message. In Zanzibar, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Zaire, ozone zones make zebras run zany zigzags. If this were to be encrypted, then the codebreaker would have to apply frequency analysis in a flexible way, so as not to be caught out by the unusually high number of Zs. Nevertheless, the text could still be deciphered in a matter of hours. The security of the substitution cipher had been destroyed. By the 16th century, Western codebreakers had taken on board the techniques of frequency analysis, and those sending secret messages could no longer be confident that their letters were not being read by the enemy. However, cipher secretaries had nothing else to rely on apart from the substitution cipher, and so they continued to employ it for their correspondence, even though they were aware of its frailty. In 1586, some letters were smuggled into the English prison that was holding Mary, Queen of Scots. She had arrived in England 18 years earlier, having fled from Scotland, where she was being threatened by Scottish nobles. She had sought protection from her English cousin, Elizabeth I, but the Protestant English queen saw Mary as a Catholic rival and immediately imprisoned her. One of the letters to Mary had been sent by Anthony Babington, a 24-year-old Catholic rebel. Babington's letter described how he and his colleagues would assassinate Elizabeth and then release Mary and put her on the English throne. Mary immediately sent a reply to Babington, giving her blessing to the plot. All the correspondence between Mary and Babington had been enciphered, and the letters were smuggled into and out of her prison by Gilbert Gifford. Each letter was wrapped in a leather packet, which was then hidden inside a hollow bung used to seal a barrel of beer. Gifford was in cahoots with the local brewer, who would take the barrels into and out of Mary's prison. Neither Mary nor Babington were aware that Gifford was a double agent. Each time that Gifford was supposed to deliver a letter to or from Mary, he would make a detour and visit Sir Francis Walsingham, Principal Secretary to Queen Elizabeth and her chief spymaster. Walsingham passed the enciphered correspondence to his chief codebreaker, Thomas Phillips. A master of frequency analysis, it was merely a matter of time before Phillips would decipher Mary's letters. He established the frequency of each character and tentatively proposed values for those that appeared most often. When a particular approach hinted at absurdity, he would backtrack and try alternative substitutions. Gradually, the significance of Mary's reply to Babington began to emerge. Mary's letter endorsed Babington's plot, and this was the crucial evidence that would lead to Mary's trial and execution. Phillips marked the letter with a gallows sign. The trial was held in Fotheringay Castle, a bleak, miserable place in the middle of the featureless fens of East Anglia. Mary's main defence was to deny any connection with Babington. "Can I be responsible for the criminal projects of a few desperate men," she proclaimed, "which they planned without my knowledge or participation?" But the deciphered correspondence proved that this was not the case. The death penalty was recommended, and Elizabeth signed the warrant. On the 8th of February 1587, in the great hall of Fotheringay Castle, an audience of 300 gathered to watch the beheading. Walsingham was determined to minimize Mary's influence as a martyr, and he ordered that the block, Mary's clothing, and everything else relating to the execution should be burned in order to avoid the creation of any holy relics. Mary was equally determined that her final appearance should be a defiant gesture, an opportunity to reaffirm her Catholic faith and inspire her followers. Richard Wingfield, in his narration of the last days of the Queen of Scots, described her final moments. While one of the executioners held her slightly with one of his hands, the other gave 2 strokes with an axe before he cut off her head, at which time she made very small noise and stirred not any part of herself from the place where she lay. Her lips stirred up and down almost a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off. Then one of her executioners, plucking off her garters, espied her little dog, which was crept under her clothes, which could not be gotten forth but with force, and afterwards could not depart from her dead corpse, but came and lay between her head and shoulders, a thing diligently noted. By the 18th century, each European capital city had its own code-breaking industry. Teams of government code-breakers worked in so-called black chambers, nerve centres for deciphering messages and gathering intelligence. The most celebrated, disciplined and efficient was the Viennese black chamber. It operated according to a rigorous timetable because it was vital that its nefarious activities did not interrupt the smooth running of the postal service. Letters which were supposed to be delivered to embassies in Vienna were first routed via the black chamber, where secretaries melted seals and a team of stenographers made copies of the letters. Within 3 hours, the letters had been resealed in their envelopes and returned to the central post office, so that the letters could be delivered to their intended destination while codebreakers began to decipher the copies. While professional codemakers struggled to concoct a new, secure cipher, something that would baffle the black chambers, the clandestine world of cryptography began to capture the interest of the public. During the 19th century, English etiquette forbade young lovers from openly expressing their affection, so much so that they could not even exchange letters. This resulted in lovers sending encrypted messages to each other via the personal columns of newspapers. These agony columns, as they became known, provoked the curiosity of amateur codebreakers, who would try to decipher the titillating contents of the messages. Another illustration of the public's familiarity with cryptography was the use of pinprick encryption. The ancient Greek historian Aeneas the Tactician suggested conveying a secret message by pricking tiny holes under particular letters in an apparently innocuous page of text. The punctured letters would spell out a secret message, easily read by the intended receiver. However, if anybody else stared at the page, they would probably be oblivious to the barely perceptible pinpricks, and would be unaware of the secret message. 19th century letter writers used exactly the same method, not to achieve secrecy, but to avoid paying excessive postage costs. Before the overhaul of the postage system in the mid-1800s, sending a letter cost about $1 for every 100 miles, beyond the means of most people. But newspapers were allowed to travel free, and this provided a loophole for the thrifty Victorians. Instead of writing and sending letters, people began to use pinpricks to spell out a message on the front page of a newspaper. They could then send the newspaper through the post without having to pay a penny. As a result of this interest in codes and ciphers, novelists began to feature cryptography in their writing. In Jules Verne's Voyage to the Centre of the Earth, the decipherment of a parchment filled with runic characters provides the first step on the epic journey. In Britain, one of the finest writers of cryptographic fiction was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Not surprisingly, Sherlock Holmes was an expert in cryptography, and as he explained to Dr. Watson, was the author of a trifling monograph upon the subject in which I analyse 160 separate ciphers. The most famous of Holmes's decipherments is recounted in The Adventure of the Dancing Men, which involves a cipher consisting of stick men, each pose representing a distinct letter. On the other side of the Atlantic, Edgar Allan Poe wrote a short story about ciphers, which is widely acknowledged by professional cryptographers to be the finest piece of fictional literature on the subject. The Goldbug tells the story of William Legrand, who discovers an unusual beetle, the goldbug, and collects it using a scrap of paper lying nearby. That evening he sketches the goldbug upon the same piece of paper, and then holds his drawing up to the light of the fire to check its accuracy. However, his sketch is obliterated by an invisible ink, which has been developed by the heat of the flames. Legrand examines the characters that have emerged and becomes convinced that he has in his hands the enciphered directions for finding Captain Kidd's treasure. The remainder of the story is a clear description of how one unravels such a cipher, culminating in the discovery of buried treasure. Although The Goldbug is pure fiction, there is a true 19th century story with many of the same elements. The case of the Beale ciphers involves Wild West escapades, a cowboy who amassed a vast fortune, a buried treasure worth $20 million, and a mysterious set of encrypted papers describing its whereabouts. The story begins in 1820 in the town of Lynchburg, Virginia. In January of that year, a stranger by the name of Thomas J. Beale rode into Lynchburg and checked into the Washington Hotel. According to Robert Morris, the hotel owner, the stranger was about 6 feet in height, with jet black eyes and hair of the same colour, worn longer than was the style at the time. He was extremely popular with everyone, particularly the ladies. Morris did not learn anything about Beale's background or the reason for his visit to Lynchburg, and at the end of March, Beale left as suddenly as he had arrived. However, 2 years later, in January 1822, Beale returned to the Washington Hotel. Once again, he spent the rest of the winter in Lynchburg and disappeared in the spring. But not before he entrusted Morris with a locked iron box, which he said contained papers of value and importance. Morris placed the box in a safe and thought nothing more about it and its contents until a few weeks later, when he received a letter from Beale. After a few pleasantries and a paragraph about an intended trip to the plains to hunt the buffalo and encounter the savage grizzlies, Beale explained the significance of the box. It contains papers vitally affecting the fortunes of myself and many others engaged in business with me, and in the event of my death, its loss might be irreparable. You will, therefore, see the necessity of guarding it with vigilance. Morris dutifully guarded the box, waiting for Beale to collect it, but the man of mystery did not return to Lynchburg. He disappeared without trace, never to be seen again. Eventually, 23 years later, in 1845, Morris's curiosity got the better of him, and he cracked open the lock. Inside the box, he found a note written by Beale in plain English, and 3 enciphered messages. The note revealed the truth about Beale, the box, and the ciphers. In April 1817, almost 3 years prior to his first meeting with Morris, Beale and 29 others had embarked on a journey across America. After travelling through the rich hunting grounds of the Western Plains, they arrived in Santa Fe before heading north in search of buffalo. Then, according to Beale's note, they struck lucky. The party, encamped in a small ravine, were preparing their evening meal when one of the men discovered in a cleft of the rocks something that had the appearance of gold. Upon showing it to the others, it was pronounced to be gold, and much excitement was the natural consequence. The letter went on to explain that Beale and his men mined the site for the next 18 months, by which time they had accumulated a large quantity of gold, as well as some silver which was found nearby. In due course, they agreed that their newfound wealth should be moved to a secure place and decided to take it back home to Virginia, where they would hide it in a secret location. In 1820, Beale travelled to Lynchburg with the gold and silver, found a suitable location, and buried it. It was on this occasion that he first made the acquaintance of Morris. When Beale left at the end of the winter, he rejoined his men who had continued to work the mine during his absence. After another 18 months, Beale revisited Lynchburg with even more to add to his stash. This time, there was an additional reason for his trip. My companions on the plane suggested that, in case of an accident to ourselves, the treasure so concealed would be lost to their relatives. I was, therefore, instructed to select some perfectly reliable person who should be confided in to carry out their wishes in regard to their respective shares. Beale believed that Morris was a man of integrity, which is why he trusted him with a box containing the 3 enciphered sheets, the so-called Beale ciphers. The first sheet described the treasure's location, the second outlined the contents of the treasure, and the third listed the relatives of the men who should receive a share of the treasure. Working on the assumption that Beale and his men were dead, Morris felt obliged to find the gold and share it among their relatives. However, in order to do this, he had to decipher the 3 cryptic sheets. This task occupied his mind for the next 20 years and ended in failure. In 1862, at the age of 84, Morris knew that he was coming to the end of his life and realized that he had to share the secret of the Beale ciphers. Otherwise, any hope of carrying out Beale's wishes would die with him. Morris confided in a friend, but unfortunately, the identity of this person remains a mystery. However, we do know that it was Morris's friend who made the first breakthrough by deciphering one of Beale's cryptic papers. The second Beale cipher, like the other 2, contains dozens of numbers, and Morris's friend guessed that each number corresponded to a word in the Declaration of Independence. For example, the first number in the second Beale cipher is 115. The 115th word of the Declaration is instituted, which begins with the letter I. Hence, the first number, 115, represents the letter I. The second number in the cipher is 73. The 73rd word in the Declaration is hold, which begins with the letter H. By continuing this process, Morris's friend revealed the following message from Beale. I have deposited in the county of Bedford, in a vault 6 feet below the surface of the ground, the following articles: 2,921 pounds of gold and 5,100 pounds of silver. The successful decipherment indicated the value of the treasure, at least £10 million at today's bullion prices. Unfortunately, this approach did not provide the key to deciphering the other 2 Beale ciphers. In particular, the Beale cipher that described the location of the treasure remained a mystery. Not surprisingly, once Morris's friend knew the value of the treasure, he spent increasing amounts of time analysing the remaining Beale ciphers. But despite strenuous efforts, he failed to make any progress. In 1885, he decided to unburden himself by publishing everything he knew in a pamphlet, choosing to remain anonymous so as not to be pestered by eager treasure hunters. The pamphlet contained the successful decipherment, the unbroken ciphers, and the story as told by Morris to the pamphlet's author. During the last century, professional code breakers, computer experts, and hundreds of amateurs have tried to crack the 2 remaining ciphers, but as yet there has been no breakthrough. Some have argued that the Beale ciphers are nothing more than a clever hoax, but historical research supports many of the details in the pamphlet. There was a Thomas J. Beale and a Robert Morris, and Cheyenne legend dating from around 1820 tells of gold and silver being taken from the west and buried in eastern mountains. Consequently, the tale of the Beale ciphers continues to enthrall codebreakers and treasure hunters. However, anybody who might be tempted to take up the challenge of the Beale ciphers should take heed of some words of caution given by the author of the pamphlet. Before giving the papers to the public, I would give them a little advice, acquired by bitter experience. It is to devote only such time as can be spared from your legitimate business to the task, and if you can spare no time, let the matter alone. Never, as I have done, sacrifice your own and your family's interests to what may prove an illusion. But as I have already said, when your day's work is done, and you are comfortably seated by your good fire, a short time devoted to the subject can injure no one, and may bring its reward. At the outbreak of the First World War, cryptography was in disarray. The science of secret communication was struggling because all known codes and ciphers were vulnerable to attack, and so the search was on for a new, stronger type of encryption. The situation was particularly desperate because of the advent of radio. Wireless communication was a boon to the military because radio waves emanate in all directions and can reach almost anywhere. That meant that a general could communicate with his battalions no matter where they were. However, the all-pervasive nature of radio is also its greatest weakness because it is inevitable that messages will also reach the enemy. If the enemy could intercept every single radio message, then cryptographers had to find a way of preventing them from deciphering these messages. Between 1914 and 1918, there were to be no great discoveries, merely a catalogue of cryptographic failures. Code makers conjured up several new ciphers, but in each case it was merely a matter of time before it was cracked by the code breakers. In particular, the Allied code breakers consistently broke German ciphers, and their influence on the First World War is best illustrated by the decipherment of a German telegram that was intercepted by the British on the 17th of January 1917. Just a week earlier, on the 9th of January 1917, the German Supreme High Command held a momentous meeting. Previously, the Germans had agreed that U-boats must surface before firing their torpedoes, a restriction that would limit accidental attacks on civilian shipping. But now, German commanders were agreed on a course of all-out U-boat aggression. Although such a change of policy would cut off supply lines and starve Britain into submission within 6 months, the Germans were fearful that their plan might backfire. Up until this point, President Woodrow Wilson had kept America neutral, but the inevitability of civilian casualties threatened to draw America into the war. So the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, decided to draw up an insurance policy. Zimmermann sent a telegram to the President of Mexico, stating that in the case of America entering the war, then Germany would support a Mexican invasion of America, helping it to reclaim territories such as Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. If Zimmermann's plan worked, then America would be too busy defending itself at home to become involved in the European conflict. Zimmermann knew that the British were tapping the transatlantic cable, and so he took the precaution of encrypting the telegram before sending it to Mexico. However, he underestimated the skills of the British codebreakers, who immediately set to work deciphering the telegram. The Admiralty's code-breaking office, known as Room 40, employed a strange mixture of linguists, classical scholars, and crossword addicts, capable of the most ingenious feats of code-breaking. The task of cracking this particular telegram fell to the Reverend William Montgomery and the former publisher Nigel de Grey. The telegram was encrypted using a code that they were already familiar with, and so they soon unravelled the outline of Zimmermann's plan. The chief of Room 40, Admiral Sir William Hall, considered showing the telegram to the Americans in order to persuade them to join the Allies, but then he had second thoughts. If the Americans entered the war because of the telegram, then the Germans would realise that their diplomatic code had been broken, and they might then upgrade their codes, depriving the British of valuable intelligence. Furthermore, unrestricted U-boat warfare was due to begin in just a matter of days, and this in itself might provoke the Americans into entering the war. Why risk losing a source of intelligence if the Americans might already be on the verge of joining the Allies? On the 1st of February, Germany embarked on its strategy of unrestricted naval warfare. But 2 days later, President Wilson announced to Congress that America would continue to remain neutral. This left Admiral Hall with no choice but to exploit the Zimmermann telegram. At the beginning of the year, Wilson had said that it would be a crime against civilization to lead his nation to war. But the Zimmermann telegram forced him to change his mind. I advise that the Congress declare the recent course of the imperial government to be in fact nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States, and that it formally accept the status of belligerent which has thus been thrust upon it. A single breakthrough by Room 40's codebreakers had succeeded where 3 years of intensive diplomacy had failed. The security blunders of the First World War inspired post-war engineers to invent a mechanical form of encryption, something more sophisticated than paper and pencil, something that would re-establish secure communications. One of the first to meet the challenge was Arthur Scherbius, inventor of the infamous and complex Enigma machine. The Enigma operator would type a letter into the machine, which would send an electrical pulse through a series of wires so as to illuminate a letter on a lamp board. So typing in A might illuminate the letter G. However, after encrypting each letter, the wiring automatically changed, so typing A again would illuminate a different letter. In other words, the mode of encryption for every letter was continually changing. Furthermore, the changes depended on an initial setting chosen by the operator, and there are millions of billions of possible settings. With so many possible settings, and with the machine's internal wirings in constant flux, the Enigma seemed to offer Germany a distinct advantage at the outbreak of the Second World War. However, we now know that the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park broke the Enigma cipher, enabling Churchill to read the messages of the German Army, Navy and Luftwaffe, and to gain a clear advantage in the war. The cracking of the Enigma proves that complexity alone is no guarantee of security, and in fact, the most secure Second World War code was also one of the simplest. In 1942, Philip Johnston, an engineer based in Los Angeles, formulated a system of secret communication based entirely on his childhood experiences. The son of a Protestant missionary, Johnston had grown up on the Navajo reservations of Arizona and became fully immersed in Navajo culture. He learned to speak the language fluently, which allowed him to act as an interpreter for discussions between the Navajo and government agents. He became aware that the language was impenetrable to anybody outside the tribe, and then realized that it could act as an unbreakable code. If each battalion employed a pair of Native Americans as radio operators, secure communication could be guaranteed. Accompanied by 2 Navajos, he took his idea to Camp Elliott, just outside San Diego, and conducted a demonstration in front of senior Marine officers. The 2 Navajos were isolated from each other, and the first one was given 6 typical messages in English, which he translated into Navajo and transmitted to his colleague via a radio. The Navajo receiver translated the messages back into English, wrote them down, and handed them over to the officers, who compared them with the originals. The game of Navajo whispers was flawless. Johnston was given the go-ahead to recruit 29 Native Americans as part of a pilot project. The official report explained why the Navajo were the best tribe for the job. The Navajo is the only tribe in the United States that has not been infested with German students during the past 20 years. These Germans, studying the various tribal dialects under the guise of art students, anthropologists, etc., have undoubtedly attained a good working knowledge of all tribal dialects, except Navajo. When America entered the Second World War, the Navajo lived in harsh conditions and were treated as inferior people. And yet the Tribal Council supported the war effort and issued a statement of loyalty, declaring that there exists no purer concentration of Americanism than among the first Americans. Within 4 months of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Navajo, some as young as 15, began an 8-week communications course with the Marine Corps. The Navajo code talkers, as they became known, soon encountered a serious problem. How could they translate military jargon into the Navajo language? To get around the problem, they constructed a formal lexicon of Navajo terms. For example, different types of plane were identified by the Navajo words for different types of birds. Fighter planes were labeled as hummingbirds, or dahetihi, and bombers were labeled as buzzards, or jay-sho. The lexicon eventually grew to over 500 words, but the code talkers would inevitably come across words that were neither in the lexicon nor had obvious translations into Navajo. This second problem was solved by constructing a Navajo phonetic alphabet. To transmit a name, such as Peter, the code talker would spell it out as pig, elk, turkey, elk, rabbit, which translates as Bisodich, Zech, Tongji, Zech, Gach. The code talkers had to memorize the phonetic alphabet and the entire lexicon, so that there was no risk of a code book falling into enemy hands. For the Navajo, committing everything to memory was a trivial exercise, because traditionally their language did not have a written script, and so they were used to memorizing their songs, prayers, folk stories, and family histories. On the 7th of August 1942, the U.S. 1st Marine Division spearheaded an invasion of the Pacific island of Guadalcanal, taking with them the first group of Navajo code talkers to see action. They soon proved their worth in the battlefield. During one on the island of Saipan, a battalion of Marines took over positions previously held by Japanese soldiers. Suddenly, a salvo exploded nearby. They were under friendly fire from fellow Americans who were unaware of their advance. The English-speaking operators sent a radio message explaining the situation, but the salvos continued because the attacking US troops were suspicious that the messages were Japanese impersonators trying to fool them. It was only when a Navajo message was sent that the attackers realized their mistake and halted the assault. A Navajo message could never be faked and could always be trusted. Their war of words soon turned the Navajo into heroes. Other soldiers would offer to carry their radios and rifles, and they were even given personal bodyguards, partly to protect them from their own comrades. On at least 3 occasions, code talkers were mistaken for Japanese soldiers and captured by fellow Americans. As the war in the Pacific intensified, the Navajo code talkers played an increasingly vital role. During the first days of the attack on Iwo Jima, more than 800 Navajo messages were sent, all without error. According to Major General Howard Connor, without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. The contribution of the Navajo code talkers is all the more remarkable when you consider that in order to fulfill their duties, they often had to confront and defy their own deeply held spiritual fears. The Navajo believe that the spirits of the dead, Chindi, will seek revenge on the living unless ceremonial rites are performed on the body. The war in the Pacific was particularly bloody, with corpses strewn across the battlefields, and yet the code talkers summoned up the courage to carry on regardless of the Chindi that haunted them. One of the Navajo recounts an incident which typifies their bravery, dedication, and composure. In the wee hours, with no relief on our side or theirs, there was a dead standstill. It must have gotten so that this one Japanese couldn't take it anymore. He got up, screamed at the top of his voice, and dashed over our trench, swinging a long samurai sword. I imagine he was shot from 25 to 40 times before he fell. There was a buddy with me in the trench, but that Japanese had cut him across the throat, clear through to the cords on the back of his neck. He was still gasping through his windpipe, and the sound of him trying to breathe was horrible. He died, of course. When the Jap struck, warm blood spattered all over my hand that was holding a microphone. I was calling in code for help. They tell me that in spite of what happened, every syllable of my message came through. It would be easy to see the development of post-war cryptography as being dominated by the development of the computer. Certainly code makers have exploited the power of computers to scramble messages, and the only hope for code breakers has been to use even more powerful computers to try to unscramble them. However, the most important post-war breakthrough in the science of secrecy has nothing to do with computers. In fact, it is a conceptual rather than a technological advance, one which defies all common sense and which solves a fundamental problem in cryptography. To explain the problem, cryptographers often talk about 3 characters: Alice, Bob, and Eve. Typically, Alice wants to send a secret personal message to Bob, but Eve, the eavesdropper, is trying to intercept the message. Naturally, Alice wants to protect the message by scrambling it, but in order for this to work, Bob has to be able to unscramble the message, which means that he needs to know the recipe that Alice used to scramble the message in the first place. The scrambling recipe is known as the key, and Alice has to somehow get the key to Bob without it falling into the hands of Eve. This predicament is known as the key distribution problem. In the 1970s, everybody using secret codes, from banks to the military, had to find a way around the key distribution problem. Essentially, the only solution was for Alice to send the key to Bob via a trusted courier, so that she could use the key to encrypt a message at a later date. Banks employed special dispatch riders, men and women who had been vetted, and who had to be among the company's most trusted employees. These dispatch riders would race across the country with padlocked briefcases, personally distributing keys to everyone that the bank would communicate with over the next week. The bank could then use the keys to send encrypted messages over a phone line or via a computer link. The distribution of US government keys is the responsibility of ComSec, short for Communications Security, and in the 1970s they would transport tons of keys around the world every day. When ships carrying ComSec material came to dock, Crypto custodians would march on board, collect stacks of cards, paper tapes, floppy disks, or whatever other medium the keys might be stored on, and then deliver them to the intended recipient. Key distribution might seem like a mundane issue, but it was the greatest problem in cryptography. It was the weakest link in the chain of security, because there was always the risk of a courier selling keys to the enemy. Also, as communication networks grew, so did the problem, and it became clear that key distribution was turning into a logistical nightmare, making secure communication prohibitively expensive. Finding a solution seemed to be impossible. If Alice wants to share a secret with Bob, namely the message, then she must first agree another secret with him, namely the key. The only way to send the key securely is to deliver it in person or via a courier, in which case Alice might as well deliver the message in person or via a courier. The entire cryptographic community accepted that the key distribution problem was unavoidable, except, that is, for 3 maverick Americans. The first maverick was Whitfield Diffie, one of the most ebullient cryptographers in the world. He introduces himself as being a real-life Tigger. No matter his weight in pounds, shillings and ounces, he always seems bigger because of the bounces. Back in the early 1970s, Diffie foresaw the digital revolution and the advent of the internet, but at the same time, he knew that the full benefit of the information age could only be realized if the key distribution problem could be tackled. He told others about his ambition to solve this age-old problem, but over and over the response was a mixture of amusement and skepticism. Then, on a trip to California, he bumped into Martin Hellman, a kindred spirit and a professor at Stanford University. They were soon joined by another intellectual rebel, Ralph Merkle, and together the 3 of them set about trying to find a solution to the key distribution problem. They began by stripping the problem down to its bare essentials. One of the best ways to analyze the problem is to think of encryption in terms of locking a message inside a box. Alice puts her message in a box, puts a padlock on the box, and then sends it to Bob. Unfortunately, he cannot open the padlock and get to the message in the box unless he has a copy of Alice's key, and we run into the key distribution problem again. Alice cannot securely send Bob a message unless she has already sent him the key. Diffie, Hellman and Merkle came up with dozens of ideas, but all of them were flawed. They soon became known as the Fools, because only a fool would attempt to solve such an impossible problem. Then, in 1975, the Fools made a breakthrough. Instead of the sender, Alice, taking responsibility for security, what if the receiver, Bob, played the crucial role? They pictured a scenario in which Bob designed a padlock and a key. Although he would make only one copy of the key, which he would keep with him at all times, Bob would manufacture hundreds of padlocks and distribute them to post offices all over the world. Then, if Alice wants to send a message to Bob, she would simply go to her local post office, ask for one of Bob's padlocks, and then lock the message in a box locked using Bob's padlock. Alice and anybody else can easily lock Bob's padlock shut, but only Bob has the key to open the padlock. The key never leaves Bob, and so the key distribution problem no longer exists. By using Bob's padlock instead of one of her own, Alice could send a completely secure message to him, a message that Bob, and only Bob, can access. By simply reversing the accepted protocol, by putting the onus on the receiver to provide the padlock, Diffie, Hellman and Merkle had made the greatest breakthrough in the history of secret communication. The cryptographic establishment had always accepted the key distribution problem as an avoidable obstacle, but the Mavericks had questioned the axiom and proved that it was not an inevitable part of secret communication. Of course, in the computer age, we cannot use real padlocks to secure messages, and scientists had to develop a mathematical padlock, a virtual analogue of the metal padlock. By 1977, researchers at Harvard had designed just such a mathematical padlock, a system known as public key cryptography, an invention which went on to form the basis of a $200 million company. Nowadays, mathematical padlocks are at the heart of the internet explosion, helping to secure sensitive emails and guaranteeing that snoopers cannot steal your credit card details when you make an internet purchase. Not only do these padlocks circumvent the key distribution problem, but they are also effectively uncrackable. Not surprisingly, Diffie, Hellman and Merkle have become heroes of the information age. However, there are also some forgotten heroes. It recently came to light that British cryptographers working at GCHQ in Cheltenham also invented the idea of mathematical padlocks before the Americans made their breakthrough. But they never gained any recognition because their research was classified. James Ellis was a curious and slightly eccentric character, a code expert who joined GCHQ's Communications Electronic Security Group on the 1st of April 1965. He always challenged the orthodoxy. He relished apparently impossible problems, and he became obsessed with the problem of key distribution. He was notorious for hoarding scientific journals, and he would regularly sift through the publications searching for inspiration. One day in 1969, he stumbled upon a paper that got him thinking about a possible solution to the key distribution problem. Later that night, while lying in bed, he had a revelation. He envisaged the same sort of mathematical padlock that the Americans would develop some 5 years later. James Ellis wrote a brief memorandum outlining his breakthrough, which was immediately classified top secret by his bosses. At this stage, Ellis had grasped the concept of a mathematical padlock, but he was unable to do the mathematics required to turn the idea into a workable system. 3 years would pass before 2 young Cambridge graduates built on Ellis's idea, inventing 2 separate types of mathematical padlock. First, there was Clifford Cox, who had only just been recruited by GCHQ. Within a few hours of hearing about Ellis's work, he had come up with a complete solution to the key distribution problem. Then Malcolm Williamson, another GCHQ rookie, tried to prove that Cox had made a mistake because his breakthrough seemed to be too good to be true. Instead of finding a flaw in Cox's method, he ended up inventing his independent method, another concrete solution to the key distribution problem. The threesome of Ellis, Cox and Williamson had made the greatest breakthrough in the history of secret communication, but their genius went unrecognized by the rest of the world. The nature of cryptographic research means that many of its practitioners have had to come to terms with the fact that they can never achieve wealth, fame or glory. Charles Babbage, a pioneer of modern computing, made the greatest breakthrough in code breaking of the 19th century, but his achievement was not publicized because of its value to the nation during the Crimean War. Similarly, Alan Turing was one of the foremost codebreakers at Bletchley Park during the Second World War, but his vital contribution to the war effort was not recognized until after his death. The Navajo code talkers, whose code was used to great effect in the Pacific Campaign, were forbidden to talk about their courageous war of words for over 2 decades. Ellis, Cox and Williamson could not reveal their brilliant achievement to fellow cryptographers, family and friends, although Cox was allowed to tell his wife what he had done, because she too worked at GCHQ and had security clearance. In the mid-1970s, when Diffie, Hellman and Merkel began independently to rediscover what had already been invented at GCHQ, the 3 Britons had to watch in silence as the Americans took all the credit for what was a brilliant piece of research. By the mid-1980s, the whole world knew about the solution to the key distribution problem, and so there was really nothing to be lost in GCHQ revealing the contribution of Ellis, Cox and Williamson. In fact, there were distinct advantages in going public. The ethos of Thatcherism meant that GCHQ was expanding its services beyond the traditional military and diplomatic customer, and an announcement claiming credit for the greatest cryptographic invention in history would certainly have boosted its reputation among potential customers. Just as GCHQ were about to go public in 1987, retired British intelligence officer Peter Wright published his controversial memoirs, Spycatcher, which was sufficiently embarrassing to engender a hats-on, heads-down attitude, which in turn meant that the work of Ellis, Cox and Williamson remained classified. It would take another decade before GCHQ would eventually be ready to go public, 28 years after Ellis's initial breakthrough. In the summer of 1997, the British government decided that Clifford Cox could reveal the secret history of GCHQ's breakthrough in secret communication later in the year at a conference that he would be attending on the 18th of December. At last, Clifford Cox and Graham Williamson would get the credit they deserved. But sadly, James Ellis, aged 73, died just 1 month before the conference. In a recently declassified document written in 1987, Ellis recorded his contribution to public key cryptography, including his thoughts on the secrecy that so often surrounds cryptographic work. Cryptography is a most unusual science. Most professional scientists aim to be the first to publish their work. because it is through dissemination that the work realizes its value. In contrast, the fullest value of cryptography is realized by minimizing the information available to potential adversaries. Revelation of secrets is normally only sanctioned in the interests of historical accuracy after it has been demonstrated that no further benefit can be obtained from continued secrecy. In February 1993, two government investigators called at the house of Phil Zimmerman, a computer scientist living in Boulder, Colorado. He invited them in, made them coffee, and learned that he was being accused of exporting munitions. The word munitions conjures up machine guns, rifles, bombs, and hand grenades, but in Zimmerman's case, the munition was a computer program, a piece of encryption software capable of guaranteeing the secrecy of emails. Zimmerman had always been a political activist. Back in the 1980s, he had been a committed member of the anti-nuclear movement, lobbying senior politicians, organizing a local group, and attending numerous demonstrations. He was even arrested during a protest at the Nevada nuclear testing grounds. When the Cold War came to an end, Zimmerman began to look for another outlet for his political zeal, and he became obsessed with issues relating to individual privacy and the science of cryptography. Cryptography is all about codes and ciphers, methods for keeping secrets and guaranteeing privacy. For centuries, cryptography had been used by the military and diplomats to protect their communications. It seemed to be an obscure science, of little relevance to everyday life. But Zimmerman realized that things were about to change, and that soon cryptography would become important to every citizen. As we enter the information age, we will rely increasingly on accessing and transmitting information. The information might be our personal details, our bank balances, our internet purchases, or simply our correspondence. But whatever it is important to protect it from prying eyes. Cryptography can offer that protection, which is why cryptographers are fond of saying that codes and ciphers will provide the locks and keys of the information age. Unfortunately, in the late 1980s, cryptography products were expensive, required experts to operate them, and they only worked on powerful computers. In other words, cryptography and the privacy it brought was only available to big businesses, governments, and the military. Hence, Zimmerman took it upon himself to design an encryption program for the average person, something that could run on a home computer, something that was user-friendly, something that would protect the privacy of the individual. He called his project Pretty Good Privacy, or PGP for short. The name was inspired by Ralph's Pretty Good Groceries, one of the sponsors of Garrison Keillor's radio show Prairie Home Companion. Zimmerman was a big fan of Garrison Keillor. Over the course of several months, he built his encryption program bit by bit. He borrowed ideas from other encryption systems, sometimes with the permission of the authors, sometimes without. And whenever possible, he would implement shortcuts so that the final product would function within the limited capacity of a home computer. At the same time, he never compromised the security of Pretty Good Privacy. PGP had to guarantee privacy. By the summer of 1991, PGP was ready to be released. Zimmerman gave a copy of the program to a friend who posted it on the internet, from where it could be downloaded by anyone for free. Within a few hours, cryptographic aficionados had access to PGP. Within a few days, it had been downloaded by the wider community of internet enthusiasts, and by the end of the year, it permeated into the most remote corners of cyberspace. Zimmerman even received emails from resistance groups in Burma who were using PGP in jungle training camps to encrypt their records. Prior to the advent of PGP, captured documents would lead to the arrest, torture, and execution of entire families, but now such information was protected by cryptography. Another email in praise of Zimmerman came from someone in Latvia on the day that Boris Yeltsin was shelling the Latvian parliament building. Phil, let it never be, but if dictatorship takes over Russia, then your PGP is already widespread from the Baltic to the Far East, and it will help democratic people. Thank you. It was 18 months after the launch of PGP that government agents paid Zimmerman a visit. The US government classified encryption as a munition, and as such it could not be exported. In short, by putting PGP on the internet, Zimmerman was, according to the US government, an arms dealer. and he became the subject of an FBI inquiry and a grand jury investigation. Initially, this seems like an overreaction. Surely the FBI should be tracking down drug dealers, cracking organized crime rings, and fighting terrorism. Why bother hounding a jovial, well-meaning computer programmer? For decades, the American police force have conducted wiretaps in order to catch criminals. For example, in the 1920s, wiretaps proved especially effective in convicting bootleggers. Then in the 1960s, wiretaps were a valuable tool in fighting the growing threat of organized crime. The FBI were having great difficulty in convicting suspects because the mob made threats against anyone who might consider testifying against them. The only hope was to gather evidence via wiretaps. And today, the FBI still maintains that court-ordered wiretapping is the single most effective investigative technique used by law enforcement to combat illegal drugs, terrorism, violent crime, espionage, and organized crime. However, criminals are already using encryption to protect themselves. The Kali cartel arranges its drugs trade via encrypted communications, and Ramzi Youssef, one of the terrorists involved in bombing the World Trade Center, kept plans for future terrorist acts encrypted on his laptop. On the other side of the world, the Aum Shinrikyo sect, responsible for the gas attacks on the Tokyo subway in 1995, were found to have encrypted some of their documents. In short, governments fear that the widespread use of encryption will allow terrorists, criminals, and rival nations to plot without fear of being overheard. Hence, they argue that encryption needs to be regulated. However, there is a counter-argument. Civil libertarians argue that widespread encryption is a boon to society. In fact, it is more than that. It is a human right, as recognized by Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. The civil libertarians argue that widespread use of encryption is essential for guaranteeing the right to privacy. Otherwise, they fear that governments and criminals could tap into the internet and thereby monitor our lives. Our bank accounts, our correspondence, our medical records would all be up for grabs. The pro-encryption lobby acknowledges that encryption might give an advantage to criminals, but they point out that every technology has a dark side, and that this alone is not sufficient reason to ban encryption. Ronald Rivest, one of the foremost cryptographic experts, draws a comparison between gloves and cryptography. A citizen can freely buy a pair of gloves, even though a burglar might use them to ransack a house without leaving fingerprints. Cryptography is a data protection technology, just as gloves are a hand protection technology. Cryptography protects data from hackers, corporate spies, and con artists, whereas gloves protect hands from cuts, scrapes, heat, cold, and infection. The former can frustrate FBI wiretapping, and the latter can thwart FBI fingerprint analysis. Cryptography and gloves are both dirt cheap and widely available. In fact, you can download good cryptographic software from the internet for less than the price of a good pair of gloves. Zimmerman, the inventor of PGP, was clearly on the side of the pro-encryption lobby, and by actively helping the spread of encryption overseas, he was risking imprisonment. But the investigation into PGP soon discovered that it was entering a very grey area. It was not Zimmerman who put PGP on the internet, it was a friend. And when something is put in cyberspace, is it being exported? Is it crossing any national boundaries? Somebody who downloads PGP may be importing it, but does that necessarily mean that Zimmerman was exporting it? After all, there was no relationship or communication between him and the importer. After 3 years, the case against Zimmerman was dropped. However, the debate about government legislation in America and around the world is as contentious as ever, and is set to continue into the 21st century. The government concern over encryption is centered on the fact that modern codes and ciphers are effectively unbreakable. Using PGP, anyone can encrypt a message and send it to a friend in Australia, and the combined efforts of all the security agencies of the world would not be enough to crack it. But everything would change if code breakers could come up with something that would destroy the security of current codes and ciphers. For centuries, code makers and code breakers have fought a continual battle, and although code makers have the upper hand at the moment, codebreakers have not given up. They are currently developing a new type of code-breaking computer known as a quantum computer. Quantum computers exploit the principles of quantum physics, a bizarre theory that stretches credibility. One of its inventors, Niels Bohr, admitted that anyone who can contemplate quantum mechanics without getting dizzy hasn't understood it. One of the tenets of quantum theory is that an object that is not being observed can exist in different states at the same time, a phenomenon known as superposition. To explain what this means, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Erwin Schrödinger invented a parable known as Schrödinger's cat. First, imagine placing a cat in a box. There are two possible states for the cat, namely dead or alive. Initially, we can see that it is alive, and so we know that the cat is definitely in one particular state, the live state. Next, we place a vial of cyanide in the box along with the cat and close the lid. We now enter a period of ignorance because we cannot see what state the cat is in. Is it still alive, or has it trodden on the vial of cyanide and died? Traditionally, we would say that the cat is either dead or alive. We just do not know which is the case. However, quantum theory says that the cat is in a superposition of two states. It is both dead and alive. It satisfies both possibilities simultaneously. A quantum computer would exploit the phenomenon of superposition to crack codes. To crack a code, the codebreaker has to find the key, typically a particular number that unlocks the code. A codebreaker with a conventional computer would have to check billions of possible keys, one by one, in order to find the right one, and this could take millions of years. However, a codebreaker with a quantum computer would create a superposition of all possible keys. In other words, all the possible keys could be checked simultaneously, and the right one could be found in a matter of minutes. Ironically, quantum theory, which could potentially break all current codes via the quantum computer, could also give rise to a new type of unbreakable code known as quantum cryptography. This code relies on the so-called uncertainty principle, which means that any eavesdropper cannot accurately intercept any communication. Furthermore, any attempt to intercept would be detectable, and so any eavesdropping would immediately be spotted. Researchers have already conducted successful demonstrations of quantum cryptography. Within a decade, it might be available to governments, the military, and big businesses. And within a couple of decades, it might be available to everybody. When that happens, the quest for absolute secrecy will be over. Quantum cryptography would be the perfect code. It would guarantee privacy for everybody, as long as governments allow us to use it.
The codebook was written and abridged by Simon Singh. The reader was Simon Russell Beale, and the producer was Erin Riley.